Today I'm going to talk about sewing on a shirt button. Now you might have a little mending kit like this. It's nice to have a little scissors, some needles, some different colors of thread, but it doesn't have to be this fancy. It just has to be a spool of thread and a needle and maybe a scissors so that you can cut the thread off. So just kind of talking a little bit about buttons first. In a man's shirt, we have several buttons, and sometimes we have two buttons as far as if you want a wider cuff or a more narrow cuff. But when you look at a man's shirt, if it's a quality shirt, you're going to look at the buttons, and at the bottom of the buttons, you will find some spare buttons that the shirt has provided you to have in case you should lose one of your main buttons. The little button is usually for the shirt collar to help hold the tie in place, and then you have a couple of larger buttons to replace the buttons that are on the shirt. What you want to look at is how is the button sewn onto the shirt. Now this is sort of in an X fashion. So what do I mean by that? If you look at the different types of buttons that you might have, you have a 2-hole button and you have a 4-hole button. Most of the men's shirt are going to be a 4-hole button, and the stitches are going to run in an X. Sometimes the stitches are going to run parallel or to each other. Sometimes you might have a 2-hole button, which you just stitch from hole to hole. And so that's your basic stitches that you might have in a button that you are going to be wearing on a men's shirt. So the first thing we have to do is get a piece of thread and your needle. And when you take your thread, what you want to do is have it about a yard long, which an old-fashioned measure is about from the tip of your nose to the tip of your fingers is approximately a yard, and what you need. You want a clean cut on the thread. You don't want to just break the thread because that makes it too difficult to thread the needle. Then when you are going to thread the needle, sometimes you have to just wet the end of your thread and put it through the hole of your needle. We now have our needle threaded. We want to match the threads so that as we are getting them, the two tail ends of the thread are going to match together. So if you can see that, the two ends are the same. Now there are a couple of ways to tie a knot at the end of the thread. One, where you just take it and you wrap it around your finger, roll it, and that rolling kind of ties the knot, and then you have a knot in your thread. That's one way to do it. It's not always consistent. I actually need a bigger knot than that. I'm going to cut that method off. This is another technique, I think an easier method. So I have the two ends of the thread, the tail end of the thread, and I have the needle where it's threaded through the needle, where you have the loose thread through there. And then I take the two tail ends and I'm going to put the tail end on my fingertip, pinch it with my needle, wrap it around twice, and pull it tight. Now I'm pulling it tight between my thumb and my pointer finger. Now I'm going to take that pinch and I'm pulling the knot to the end of the thread. And I find that that is a nicer knot. It's a little bit of a larger knot. It turns out nice nearly every time, and I might still want to just clip off a little of those threads so that it's not too close to the end of the thread, or you have that extra tail. Now what I'm going to do is I want to sew my thread, my needle, or my button on. So I'm going to start, and if the button came off here, from the good side of your shirt, you're going to stick the needle through. So that needle or that knot is going to now be on the top of the thread, the fabric, underneath the button. Now close to that knot, I'm going to come up with my needle and pull it all the way snug. Now I just have a little stitch on the back side because again, sometimes the back side of your button is going to be showing. So now I'm going to drop the button onto my needle. And when I showed you the shirt, it had an X stitch. So I'm going to go from the hole that I just put the thread into. I'm going to go diagonally to the other hole and just again looking to make sure I'm close to that first knot. And I'm going to pull the thread. So I have now the thread is across from buttonhole to buttonhole, but I need a looser button. If you tied it too tight to the shirt, we're going to have a gap. It's going to look funny when you button your shirt because it's going to be too tight. So that's the purpose of the toothpick that I gave you. We're going to loosen that thread just a little bit, and we're going to put the toothpick in place so that we are sewing over that toothpick to keep it up a little bit looser onto the thread. So now what I want to do is secure that in place. I'm going to stitch again from the bottom side. I want to stitch about 3 times around from hole to hole. So that's 2. And up one more time. Now I have that diagonal done, 3 stitches. Now it's because I doubled the thread, I have 6 threads looped around the toothpick going from that diagonal. Now I'm going to just twist the toothpick so the other spots are exposed, and I'm going to come up from behind and I'm going to stitch now the diagonal going the other direction. That's 1. I'm using a totally different colored thread. What you'd want to do is match the thread to your shirt as close as possible, or whatever color thread they use to sew on the other buttons. Sometimes it's a white thread, which is a good one to have in your mending kit. Okay, now I have 3 stitches that I have done the other way, which ends up being 6 threads because I doubled my thread. And I have it, I have the toothpick. Now what I want to do is gently take that toothpick out of there. So just gently twist the toothpick out. And now what I'm going to do is tip this to the side so I can see the thread underneath my button. I have my needle on the back side of my button, and so now I'm going to come up through the back here. There's my needle behind the button, and I'm going to gently pull that. And then what I'm going to do is, it's called a shank under the button. So I'm going to take my thread and wrap it around the button nice and snug 3 times. Now I have a shank underneath that button. Now in order to tie a thread under the button, I'm going to hold a loop, and I'm going to keep going around, but I'm going to hold this last loop out, and I'm going to twirl the needle twice into that stitch, and then I'm going to pull so that that knot is under the button. Now my button is secure. I have a nice smooth back without any knots on the back side. Now of course you'd use some thread that would match your button closer so that it would look nicer. And then I'm going to have my knot underneath there. I'm going to demonstrate that knot one more time. Plus then I'll have 2 knots underneath my button. So I'm going to hold the loop out a ways, slide the thread under the button, loop it twice around the needle, then pull the needle tight, and now I have 2 knots underneath the button. I'll then take my scissors and snip the thread off. And there you have, your button is replaced and ready to wear. That's all there is to it. Now demonstrate your button by just taking a picture like this, where I can see that you did the shank and the knot underneath the button, and submit it.